Chapter 4 of The Impossibles. The Impossibles by Lawrence M. Janifer and Randall Garrett. Chapter 4. The door didn't say anything at all except Lieutenant P. Lynch. Malone looked at it for a couple of seconds. He'd asked the desk sergeant for Lynch, shown his credentials, and been directed up a set of stairs and around a hall. But he still didn't know what Lynch did, who he was, or what his name was doing in the little black notebook. Well, he told himself, there was only one way to find out. He opened the door. The room was small and dark. It had a single desk in it and 3 chairs and a hat rack. There wasn't any coat or hat on the hat rack, and there was nobody in the chairs. In a 4th chair, behind the desk, sat a huskily built man. He had steel gray hair, a hard jaw, and Malone noticed with surprise a faint twinkle in his eye. "Lieutenant Lynch?" Malone said. "Right," Lynch said. "What's the trouble?" "I'm Kenneth J. Malone, FBI." He reached for his wallet and found it. He flipped it open for Lynch, who stared at it for what seemed like a long, long time, and then burst into laughter. "What's so funny?" Malone asked. Lynch laughed some more. "Oh, come on," Malone said bitterly. "After all, there's no reason to treat an FBI agent like some kind of a—" "FBI agent?" Lynch said. "Listen, Buster, this is the funniest gag I've seen since I came on the force. Really a hell of a funny thing. Who told you to pull it? Jablonski downstairs? Or one of the boys on the beat? I know those beat patrolmen, always on the lookout for a new joke. But this tops 'em all. This is the—" "You're a disgrace to the Irish," Malone said tartly. "A what?" Lynch said. "I'm not Irish." "You talk like an Irishman," Malone said. "I know it," Lynch said and shrugged. "Around some precincts, you sort of pick it up. When all the other cops are, 'Hey, listen, how'd we get to talking about me?'" "I said you were a disgrace to the Irish," Malone said. "I was a what? Disgrace?" Malone looked carefully at Lynch. In a fight, he considered, he might get in a lucky punch that would kill Malone. Otherwise, Malone didn't have a thing to worry about except a few months of hospitalization. Lynch looked as if he were about to get mad, and then he looked down at Malone's wallet again and started to laugh. "For God's sake," Malone said, "what's so damn funny?" He grabbed the wallet and turned it toward him. At once, of course, he realized what had happened. He hadn't flipped it open to his badge at all. He had flipped it open, instead, to a card in the card case. "Know all men by these presents that Sir Kenneth Malone, Knight, is hereby formally installed with the title of Knight of the Bath, and this card shall signify his right to that title and his high and respected position as officer in and of the Queen's own FBI." In a very small voice, Malone said, "There's been a terrible mistake." "Mistake?" Lynch said. Malone flipped the wallet open to his FBI shield. Lynch gave it a good long examination, peering at it from every angle and holding it up to the light 2 or 3 times. He even wet his thumb and rubbed the badge with it. At last he looked up. "I guess you are the FBI," he said. "But what's with the gag?" "It isn't a gag," Malone said. "It's just—" He thought of the little old lady in Yucca Flats, the little old lady who had been the prime mover in the last case he and Boyd had worked on together. Without the little old lady, the case might never have been solved. She was an authentic telepath, about the best that had ever been found. But with her, Boyd and Malone had had enough troubles. Besides being a telepath, she was quite thoroughly insane. She had one fixed delusion. She believed she was Queen Elizabeth I. She was still at Yucca Flats, along with the other telepaths Malone investigation had turned up. And she still believed, quite calmly, that she was good Queen Bess. Malone had been knighted by her during the course of the investigation. This new honor had come to him through the mail. Apparently she had decided to ennoble some of her friends still further. Malone made a mental note to ask Boyd if he'd received one. After all, there couldn't be too many Knights of the Bath. There was no sense in letting everybody in. Then he realized that he was beginning to believe everything again. There had been times, working with the little old lady, when he had been firmly convinced that he was, in fact, the swaggering, ruthless swordsman Sir Kenneth Malone. And even now... "Well," Lynch said. "It's too long a story," Malone said. "And besides, it's not what I came here about." Lynch shrugged again. "Okay," he said. "Tell it your way." "First," Malone said, "what's your job?" "Me? Precinct lieutenant." "Of this precinct?" Lynch stared. "What else?" he said. "Who knows?" Malone said. He found the black notebook and passed it across to Lynch. "I'm on this red Cadillac business, you know," he said by way of introduction. "I've been hearing about it," Lynch said. He picked up the notebook without opening it and held it like a ticking bomb. "And I mean hearing about it," he said. "We haven't had any trouble at all in this precinct." "I know," Malone said. "I've read the reports." "Listen, not a single red Cadillac has been stolen from here or been reported found here. We run a tight precinct here, and let me tell you—" "I'm sure you do a fine job," Malone said hastily. "But I want you to look at the notebook, the first page." Lynch opened his mouth, closed it, and then flipped the notebook cover. He stared at the first page for a few seconds. "What's this?" he said at last. "Another gag?" "No gag, Lieutenant," Malone said. "It's your name and mine," Lynch said. "What is that supposed to mean?" Malone shrugged. "Search me," he said. "The notebook was found only a couple of feet away from another car theft last night." That was the simplest way he could think of to put it. "So I asked the commissioner who Peter Lynch was, and he told me it was you." "And by God it is," Lynch said, staring at the notebook. He seemed to be expecting it to rise and strike him. Malone said, "Have you got any idea who'd be writing about you and me?" Lynch shook his head. "If I had any ideas, I'd feel a lot better," he said. He wet his finger and turned the notebook page carefully over. When he saw the list of names on the second page, he stopped again and stared. This time he whistled under his breath. Very cautiously, Malone said, "Something?" "I'll be damned," Lynch said feelingly. "What's wrong?" Malone said. The police lieutenant looked up. "I don't know if it's wrong or what," he said. "It gives me sort of the willies. I know every one of these kids." Malone took out a pill and swallowed it in a hurry. He felt exactly as if he had been given another concussion, absolutely free and without any obligations. His mouth opened, but nothing came out for a long time. At last, he managed to say, "Kids?" "That's right," Lynch said. "What did you think?" Malone shrugged helplessly. "Every single one of them," Lynch said. "Right from around here." There was a little silence. "Who are they?" Malone said carefully. "They're some kind of kid gang, a social club or something like that. This first kid, Miguel Fueos, his full name, is the leader. They call themselves the Silent Spooks." "The what?" It seemed to Malone that the name was just a little fancy, even for a kid gang. "The Silent Spooks," Lynch said. "I can't help it. But here they are, every one of them. Fueo, Ramon Otravez, Mario Grito, Silvo Envoez, Alvarez Altapor, Felipe La Barba, Juan de los Santos, and Rey del Este. Right down the line." He looked up from the notebook with a blank expression on his face. "All of them kids from this neighborhood, the Silent Spooks." "They know you?" Malone said. "Sure they do," Lynch said. "They all know me. But do they know you? Malone thought. They could have heard of me, he said at last, trying to be as modest as possible. I guess, Lynch said grudgingly. How old are they? Malone said. 14 to 17, Lynch said. Somewhere in there. You know how these kid things run. The Silent Spooks, Malone said meditatively. It was a nice name, in a way. You just had to get used to it for a while. When he had been a kid, he had belonged to a group that called itself the East Division Street Kids. There just wasn't much romance in a name like that. Now the Silent Spooks. With a wrench, he brought his mind back to the subject at hand. Did they get into much trouble? He asked. Well, no, Lynch said reluctantly. As a matter of fact, they don't. For a bunch like that, around here, they're pretty well behaved as far as that goes. What do you mean? Malone said. Lynch's face took on a delicately unconcerned appearance. I don't know, he said. They just don't get into neighborhood trouble. Maybe a scrap now and then, nothing big, though. Or maybe one of them cuts a class at school or argues with his teacher. But there's nothing unusual, and damn little of anything. He frowned. Malone said, Something's got to be wrong. What is it? Well, Lynch said, they do seem to have a hell of a lot of money to spend. Malone sat down in a chair across the desk and leaned eagerly toward Lynch. Money? He said. Money, Lynch said. New clothes, cigarettes. Malone, 3 of them are even supporting their parents. Old Jose Otervez, Ramon's old man, quit his job a couple of months ago and hasn't worked since. Spends all his time in bars and never runs out of dough. And don't tell me you can do that on unemployment insurance or Social Security payments. Okay, Malone said. I won't tell you. And there's others. All the others, in fact. Mike Fueyo's sister dresses fit to kill like a high-fashion model. And the Greedo kid... Wait a minute, Malone said. From what you tell me, this isn't just a little extra money. These kids must be rolling in the stuff, up to their ears in dough. Listen, Lynch said sadly. Those kids spend more than I do. Hell, they do better than that. They spend more than I earn. He looked remotely sorry for himself, but not for long. Every one of those kids spends like a drunken sailor, tossing his money away on all sorts of things. Like an expense account, Malone said idly. Lynch looked up. Sorry, Malone said. I was thinking about something else. I bet you were, Lynch said with unconcealed envy. No, Malone said. Really, listen. I'll check with Internal Revenue on that money. But have you got a list of the kids' addresses? I can get one, Lynch said, and went to the door. It closed behind him. Malone sat waiting alone for a few minutes, and then Lynch came back. List'll be here in a minute, he said. He sat down behind his desk and reached for the notebook again. When he turned to the 3rd page, his expression changed to one of surprise. Be damned, he said. There does seem to be a connection, doesn't there? He held up the picture of the red Cadillac for Malone to see. Sure does, Malone said. That's why I want those addresses. If there's a connection, I sure as hell want to find out about it. 10 minutes later, Malone was walking out of the precinct station with a list of addresses in his pocket. He was heading for his great adventure, but he didn't know it. All he was thinking about was the red Cadillacs and the 8 teenagers. I'm going to get to the bottom of this if it takes me all summer, he said, muttering to himself. That's the spirit, he told himself. Never say die. Then, realizing he had just said it, he frowned. Perhaps it hadn't really counted. But then again. He was on his way down the steps when he hit the girl. The mutual collision was not catastrophic. On the other hand, it was not exactly minor. It fell somewhere between the two, as an unclassifiable phenomenon of undoubted potency. Malone said, "Ugh," with some fervor, as the girl collided with his chest and rebounded like a handball striking a wall. Something was happening to her, but Malone had no time to spare to notice just what. He was falling through space, touching a concrete step once in a while, but not long enough to make any real acquaintance with it. It seemed to take him a long time to touch bottom, and when he had, he wondered if touch was quite the right word. Bottom certainly was. He had fallen backward and landed directly on his glutei maximi, obeying the law regarding equal and opposite reaction and several other laws involving falling bodies. His first thought was he was now neatly balanced. His tail had received the same treatment as his head. He wondered if a person could get concussion of the tailbones and had reached no definite conclusion when, unexpectedly, his eyes focused again. He was looking at a girl. That was all he saw at first. She had apparently fallen just as he had, bounced once, and sat down rather hard. She was now lying flat on her back, making a sound like "rrr" between her teeth. Malone discovered that he was sitting undignifiedly on the steps. He opened his mouth to say something objectionable, took another look at the girl, and shut it with a snap. This was no ordinary girl. He smiled at her. She shook her head and sat up, still going, "Rrr." Then she stopped and said instead, "What do you think?" "I'm sorry," Malone said in what he hoped was a charming, debonair, and apologetic voice. It was quite a lot to get into one voice, but he tried his very hardest. "I just didn't see." "You didn't?" the girl said. She took a long, slow look at him, shook her head again, and then pulled her skirt down carefully. "If you didn't, you must be blind," she said. Malone noticed with hope that there was no anger in her voice. The last thing in the world he wanted was to get this girl angry at him. "Oh, no," Malone said. "I'm not blind at all." He smiled at her and stood up. His tail throbbed a little, but it didn't seem to be anything really serious. "I'm just polite," he said, and smiled again. His face was beginning to get a little tired, but he retained his last smile as he went over to her, extended a hand, and pulled her to her feet. She was something special. Her hair was long and dark and fell in soft waves to her shoulders. The shoulders were something all by themselves, but Malone postponed consideration of them for a minute to take a look at her face. It was heart-shaped and rather thin. She had large, brown, liquid eyes that could look, Malone imagined, appealing, loving, worshipping, or, like a minute ago, downright furious. Below those features she had a straight, lovely nose and a pair of lips which Malone immediately classified as kissable. Her figure, including the shoulders, was on the slim side, but she was very definitely all there. Malone couldn't think of any parts the Creator had left out, and if there were any, he didn't want to hear about them. In an instant, Malone knew that he had met the only great love of his life. Again. His mind was whirling, and for a second he didn't know what to do. And then he remembered the Queen's own FBI. Phrases flowered forth in his mind, as if it were a garden packed corner to corner with the most exquisite varieties of blooming idiots. "My deepest apologies, my dear," Sir Kenneth Malone said gallantly, even managing a small display bow for the occasion. "May I be of any assistance?" The girl smiled up at him as she came to her feet. The smile was radiant and beautiful and almost loving. Malone felt as if he couldn't stand it. Tingles of the most wonderful kind ran through him, reached his toes, and then back the other way, meeting a whole new set going forward. "You're very nice," the girl said, and the tingles became positive waves of sensation. "Actually, it was all my fault. Please don't apologize, Mr. She paused expectantly. "Me?" Malone said, his gallantry deserting him for the second. But it returned full force before he expected it. I'm Malone, he said. Kenneth Joseph Malone. He had always liked the middle name he had inherited from his father, but he never had much opportunity to use it. He made the most of it now, rolling it out with all sorts of subsidiary flourishes. As a matter of fact, he barely restrained himself from putting a "Sir" before his name. The girl's brown eyes widened just a trifle. Malone felt as if he could have fallen into them and drowned. "Oh, my," she said. "You must be a detective." And then, like the merest afterthought, "My name's Dorothy." Dorothy. It was a beautiful name. It made Malone feel all choked up inside. He blinked at the girl and tried to look manly and wonderful. It was an effort, but he nearly carried it off. After a second or two, he realized that she had asked him a question. He didn't want to disillusion her in any way, and, after all, an FBI agent was a kind of detective, but he thought it was only fair that she should know the whole truth about him right from the start. "Not exactly a detective," he said. "Not exactly?" she said, looking puzzled. She looked positively glorious when puzzled, Malone decided at once. "That is," he said carefully, "I do detect, but not for the city of New York." "Oh," she said. "A private eye. Is that right?" "Well," Malone said, "no." She looked even more puzzled. Malone hastened to explain before he got to the point where conversation was impossible. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said. After a second, he thought of a clarification and added, "FBI." "Oh," the girl said. "Oh." "But you can call me Ken," Malone said. "All right, Ken," she said. "And you can call me Dorothy." "Sure," he said. He tried it out. Dorothy. It felt swell. "Well," she said after a second. "Oh," Malone said. "Were you looking for a detective? Because if I can help in any way." "Not exactly," Dorothy said. "Just a little routine business. I'll go on in and—" Malone suddenly found himself talking without having any idea why he had started or what he was going to say. At first he said, as if the machine were warming up, and this stopped Dorothy and caused her to give him a rather sharp, baffled stare. Then he found some words and used them hurriedly before they got away. "Dorothy," he said, "would you like to take in a show this evening? I think I can get tickets to, well, I think I could get tickets to almost anything if I really tried." His expression attempted to leave no doubt that he would really try. Dorothy appeared to consider for a moment. "Well," she said at last, "how about the hot seat?" Malone felt just the way he had several years before when he had bluffed his way into a gigantic pot during a Washington poker game, with only a pair of fours to work with. At the last moment, his bluff had been called. It had, he realized, been called again. The hot seat had set some sort of record, not only for Broadway longevity, but for audience frenzy. Getting tickets for it was about the same kind of proposition as buying grass on the moon, and getting them with absolutely no prior notice would require all the wire pulling Malone could manage. He thought about the hot seat and wished Dorothy had picked something easy, like arranging for her to meet the Senate. But he swallowed bravely. "I'll do my best," he said. "Got any second choice?" "Sure," she said and laughed. "Pick any one you want. I haven't seen them all, and the ones I have seen are worth seeing again." "Oh," Malone said. "I really didn't expect you to get tickets for the hot seat," she said. "Nothing," Malone said, "is impossible." He grinned at her. "Meanwhile, where can I pick you up? Your home?" Dorothy frowned and shook her head. "No," she said. "You see, I'm living with an aunt and well, never mind." She thought for a minute. "I know," she said. "Tops." "What?" Malone said. "Tops," Dorothy said. "On 42nd Street, just east of Broadway." It's a restaurant. I don't know exactly where it is, Malone said, but if it's there, I'll find it. He looked gallant and determined. We can get something to eat there before the show, whatever the show turns out to be. Fine, Dorothy said. How about making it at 6, Malone said. She nodded. 6 it is, she said. Now bye-bye. She touched her forefinger to her lips and brushed Malone's cheek with the kissed finger. By the time the new set of tingles had begun to evaporate, she had gone into the police station. Malone heaved a great sigh of passion and held down a strong impulse to follow her and protect her. He wasn't quite sure what he was going to protect her from, but he felt certain that that would come to him when the time arrived. Nevertheless, he had work to do, unpleasant as the idea had suddenly begun to seem. He pulled a list of addresses out of his pocket and looked at the first one. Mike Fueo. Mike was the leader of the Silent Spooks, according to Lieutenant Lynch. Logically, therefore, he would be the first one to talk to. Malone tried to think of some good questions, but the best one he could come up with was, well, what about all those red Cadillacs? Somehow, he doubted that this would provide a satisfactory reply. He checked the address again and started firmly down the street, trying to think of some better questions along the way. The building was just off Amsterdam Avenue in the 80s. It had been a shining new development once, but it was beginning to slide downhill now. The metal on the window frames was beginning to look worn, and the brickwork hadn't been cleaned in a long time. Where chain fences had once protected lonely blades of grass, children, mothers, and baby carriages held sway now, and the grass was gone. Instead, the building was pretty well surrounded by a moat of sick-looking brown dirt. Malone went into the first building and checked the name against the mailboxes there, trying to ignore the combined smells of sour milk, red pepper, and here and there a whiff of unwashed humanity. It was on the 10th floor. Fueo, J. That, he supposed, would be Mike's widowed mother. Lynch had told him that much about the boy and his family. He found the elevator, which was covered with scribbles ranging from Janie loves Miguel to startling obscenities, and rode it upstairs. Apartment 1004 looked like every other apartment in the building, at least from the outside. Malone pressed the button and waited a second to hear the faint buzzing at the other side of the door. After a minute, he pressed it again. The door swung open very suddenly, and Malone stepped back. A short, wrinkled, dark-eyed woman in a print house dress was eyeing him with deep suspicion. "My daughter is not home," she announced at once. "I'm not looking for your daughter," Malone said. "I'd like to talk to Mike." "Mike?" Her expression grew even more suspicious. "You want to talk to Mike?" "That's right," Malone said. "Ah," the woman said. "You one of those hoodlum friends he has. I'm right? You can talk to Mike when I am dead and have no control over him. For now, you can just—" "Wait a minute," Malone said. He pulled out his wallet and flipped it open to show his badge, being very careful that he made the right flip this time. He didn't know exactly how this woman would react to the Queen's own FBI, but he didn't especially want to find out. She looked down at the badge without taking the wallet from him. "Ha!" she said. "You're a cop, eh?" Her eyes left the wallet and examined Malone from head to foot. It was perfectly plain that they did not like what they saw. "Cop," she said again, as if to herself. It sounded like a curse. Malone said, "Well, You want to ask me stupid questions," she said. "That is what you want to do. I'm right?" "I know nothing," she said. "Nothing of any kind." She closed her mouth and stood regarding him as if he were a particularly repulsive statue. Malone looked past her into the living room beyond the door. It was faded now, but it had once been bright and colorful. There was an old rug on the floor, and tables were everywhere. The one bright thing about the room was the assortment of flowers. There were flowers everywhere, in vases, in pots, and even in window boxes. There was also a lot of crockery statuary, mostly faded, chipped, or worn in some way. The room looked to Malone as if its last inhabitant had died 10 years before. Only the flowers had been renewed. Everything else had not only the appearance of age, but the look of having been cast up as a high water mark by the sea, which had receded and left only the tangled wreckage. The woman cleared her throat, and Malone's gaze came back to her. "I can tell you nothing," she said. "I don't want to talk to you," Malone said again. "I want to talk to Mike." Her eyes were very cold. "You from the police, and you want to talk to Mike. You make a joke. Only, I don't think the joke is very funny." "Joke?" Malone said. "You mean Mike's not here?" Her gaze never wavered. "You know he is not," she said. 10 minutes ago, the policemen were taking him away to the police station. How then could he be here?" 10 minutes ago? Malone blinked. 10 minutes ago, he had been looking for this apartment. Probably it hadn't taken Lynch's men 10 minutes to find it. They weren't strangers in New York. "He was arrested?" Malone said. "I said so, didn't I?" the woman said. "You must be crazy, or else something." Her eyes were still cold points, but Malone suddenly saw a glow behind them. The glow of tears. Mike was her son. She did not seem surprised that the police had taken him away, but she was determined to protect him. He was her son. Malone's voice was very gentle. "Why did they arrest him?" he said. The woman shrugged, a single sharp gesture. "You ask me this?" she said. "I'm not a cop," Malone said. "I'm from the FBI. I don't know anything about why the cops might have arrested Mike." "FBI?" the woman said. "It's all right," Malone said with all the assurance he could muster. "I only want to talk to him." "Ah," the woman said. Tears were playing in her eyes now, glittering on the surface. "Why they take him away, I do not know. My Mike do nothing. Nothing." "But didn't they say anything about—" "They say," the woman cried, "they say only they have orders from this Lieutenant Lynch. He is lieutenant at police station." "I know," Malone said gently. "Lieutenant Lynch wants to ask Mike questions, so police come. Take him away." Her English was beginning to lose ground as the tears came closer, as she slowly lost control. "Lynch asked for him?" Malone said. He frowned. Whatever that meant, he wanted to be there himself. And perhaps he could help the old woman in some way. Anyhow, he would try. She stared up at him stonily. "Look, Mrs. Fueo," he said, "I'm going down there to talk to Mike right now. And if he hasn't done anything, I'll see that he gets right on home to you, right away." Her expression changed a trifle. She did not actually soften, but Malone could feel the gratitude lurking behind her eyes, as if it were afraid to come out. She nodded gravely and said nothing at all. He stepped away, and she closed the door without a sound. He stood staring at the door for a few seconds. Then he turned and punched the elevator button savagely. There wasn't any time to lose. He walked back to the precinct station. Knowing the way, it took him about 5 minutes instead of the 15 it had taken him to find the Fueo residence. But he still felt as if time were passing much too fast. He ran up the steps and passed right by the desk sergeant, who apparently recognized him. He said nothing as Malone charged up the stairs and around the hall to Lynch's office. It was empty. Malone stared at it and started down the hall again without knowing where he was heading. Halfway to the stairs, he met a patrolman. "Where's Lynch?" he asked. "The lieutenant?" the patrolman said. Malone fumed. "Who else?" he said. "Where is he?" "Got some kid back in the tank or somewhere," the patrolman said. Asking him a couple of questions, that's all. He added, "Hey, listen, buddy, what do you want to see the lieutenant for? I mean, you can't just go charging into—" Malone was down the stairs before he finished. He went up to the desk. The desk sergeant looked down. "What is it this time?" he said. "A track meet?" "I'm in a hurry," Malone said. "Where are the cells? I want to see Lieutenant Lynch." The desk sergeant nodded. "Okay," he said. "But the lieutenant ain't in any of the cells. He's back in interrogation with some kid." "Take me there," Malone said. "I'll show you anyway," the desk sergeant said. "Can't leave the desk on duty." He cleared his throat and gave Malone a set of directions that took him around to the back of the station. He was repeating the directions when Malone left. There was a door at the end of a corridor at the back of the station. It was a plain wooden door with the numeral 1 stenciled on it. Malone opened it and looked inside. He was staring into a rather small, rather plain little room. There were absolutely no bright beam lights burning, and there didn't seem to be any rubber hoses around anywhere. There were only 4 chairs. Seated in 3 of the chairs were Lieutenant Lynch and 2 other police officers. In the 4th chair, facing them, was a young boy. He didn't look like a tough kid. He had wavy black hair, brown eyes, and what Malone thought looked like a generally friendly appearance. He was slight and wiry, not over 5'5" or 6, and he wore an expression that was neither too eager nor hostile. It wasn't just blank either. Malone finally pinned it down as receptive. He had the strangest impression that he had seen the boy somewhere before, but he couldn't remember when or where. Lieutenant Lynch was talking. "All we want, Mike, is a little information. We thought you'd be able to help us if you wanted to. Now, how about it?" "Sure," Mike Fuego said. His voice was a little high, but it was well controlled and responsive. "Sure, Lieutenant. I'll help if I can, but I just don't dig what you're giving me. It doesn't make sense." Lynch stirred a little impatiently, and his voice began to carry a new bite. "I'm talking about Cadillacs," he said. "Red Cadillacs. 1972 models." "It's a nice car," Mike said. "What do you know about them?" Lynch said. "Know about them?" Mike said. "I know they're nice cars. That's about it. What else am I going to know, Lieutenant? Maybe you think I own one of those big red 72 caddies? Maybe you think I got that kind of money? Well, listen, Lieutenant, I'd like to help you out, but I'm just not—" "The Cadillacs," Lynch said, "were—" "Just a minute, Lieutenant," Malone said. Dead silence fell with great suddenness. Lynch and all the others looked around at Malone, who smiled apologetically. "I don't want to disturb anything," he said, "but I would like to talk to Mike here for a little while." "Oh," Lynch said sourly. Sure. "I'd like to ask him a couple of questions," Malone said. "Alone." "Alone," Lynch said. "Oh." But there was nothing for him to do, Malone knew, except bow to the inevitable. "Of course," he said. "Go right ahead." "You can stand outside the door," Malone said. "He won't get away, and you'd better hold this." Malone, knowing perfectly well that staying armed and alone in a room with a suspect was something you just did not do, unstrapped his .44 Magnum and handed it to the lieutenant. He left reluctantly with his men. The door closed. Malone could understand Lynch's attitude. If Malone solved the case, Lynch would not get any credit. Otherwise, it might go down in his personal record. And of course, the NYPD would rather wrap the case up themselves. The FBI was treated as a necessary interference. Unfortunately, Malone thought, Lynch had had absolutely no choice. He sighed gently and turned his attention to Mike Fuego, who was still sitting in his chair. "Now, Mike," he began, and was interrupted. The door opened. Lieutenant Lynch said, "If you need us, Malone, just yell." "You'll hear me," Malone promised. The door shut. He turned back to the boy. "Now, Mike," he began, "my name is Malone, and I'm with the FBI in Washington. I'd like to ask you a few—" "Gee, Mr. Malone," Mike broke in eagerly, "I'm glad you're here. I'm really glad about that." Malone said, "Well, these cops here have been giving me a pretty rough deal, you know," Mike said. "I'm sure they—" Malone began. "But I've been looking for you," Mike went on. "See, I wanted to say something to you, something real important." Malone leaned forward expectantly. At last he was going to get some information. Perhaps the information that would break the whole case wide open. He said, "Yes?" "Well," Mike began and stopped. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Mike," Malone said. "Just tell me whatever's on your mind." "Sure," Mike said. "It's this." He took a deep breath. Malone clenched his fists. Now it was coming. Now he would hear the all-important fact. He waited. Mike stuck out his tongue and blew the longest, loudest, brassiest, and juiciest Bronx cheer that Malone had ever heard. Then, almost instantly, the room was empty except for Malone himself. Mike was gone. There wasn't any place to hide, and there hadn't been any time to hide in. Malone looked around wildly, but he had no doubts at all. Mike Fuego had vanished, utterly and instantaneously. He'd gone out like a light. End of chapter 4. Read by Paul Hampton.